Hello, I'm Coral Gartner, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar hosted by the Tobacco Endgame Centre of Research Excellence. Today we have Professor Ron Borland, who is the Professor of Health Behaviour in the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne. Ron has been one of the principal investigators with the International Tobacco Control Policy Evaluation Project since it commenced in 2002. This unique international study follows cohorts of people who smoke or recently quit smoking in many different countries, including Australia, with replacement of those lost to follow-up. The study also follows people who are using non-smoke nicotine products, such as vape nicotine products, heated tobacco products, and oral nicotine and tobacco products. Ron's presentation today will cover some results of analyses of the International Tobacco Control Policy Evaluation Project with a focus on current consumers and some challenges in assisting them to adapt to a smoke-free country. Before I hand over to the platform to Ron, I will acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are all meeting throughout Australia. I pay my respects to their ancestors and descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connection to country. I also extend this respect and acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us for this webinar today. While Ron is presenting, if you would like to put a question to him, please type this into the Q&A function and we will hopefully have some time for discussion after the presentation is completed. So thanks very much, Ron, and I'll now hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Coral, and I'd also like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose land I am speaking from. What I'm going to be doing today is to, if I can go on to the next slide, is to talk a little bit about the ITC project, because some of you may not know about it, and it is really an enormous opportunity for people who have quantitative data analysis skills to get in and use some of the underused data. Focusing on our 4-country study, which is Australia, the US, Canada and England. Now it used to be the United Kingdom, but because of changes in policies across the various parts of the United Kingdom, we're now focusing on just one of them, England. And I'm going to focus on some results presented, and they're going to be in a sort of mix of interrelated themes of understanding the challenges of getting smokers to quit, a little bit about kinds of end games and what role might an alternative nicotine model play in moving towards an end game. So there are bits of data, and they begin to tell, I think, a reasonably coherent story. So the ITC, oh God, it's one of these bloody ones with Jeff Hafong's that I didn't realise it. It was one of those ones that you've got to click on 40 times to get the entire thing. As Coral said, the ITC surveys cover now something in the vicinity of 30 countries have had at least one ITC survey conducted, and most of those have been multiple ones. So we have data from countries ranging in socioeconomic status from right at the bottom, like Bangladesh, to right at the top, like you know, the US, Australia, and other Western countries in Europe. We also have major studies in Asia, in Southeast Asia, including Japan and Korea. Essentially, the aim is to conduct similar surveys in each country. In some countries they have to be by telephone. In many of the countries they're now on the internet, but in less developed countries telephone or even face-to-face surveying is used. And we try to assess policies that are related to the Framework Convention and other policies that might affect smoking, which obviously includes endgame policies. By asking individuals, we can focus at the individual level and then begin to look at the impact of policies on individuals. And that makes the ITC surveys particularly potent, not only for understanding the impact of policies on individuals, but because of the things we measure, better understanding what's involved in helping people to quit smoking. Okay, so sorry about the dog in the background. So our aim is the rigorous evaluation of the policies, understanding why they work, and the basic notion is what's inside the black box. And once we've found out about these things, we're disseminating our findings to policymakers, and they have had influence in policies in various countries around the world. This is the original complex model that we've tended to use. A policy relates to policy-specific variables, for example, for warning labels, it's noticing and salience of the warnings, and those lead to psychosocial mediators, broad attitudes and beliefs and self-efficacy related factors, which they then lead to policy-related outcomes, which may be quit attempts, maybe changes in consumption, maybe switches in brands or price tax avoidance, for example. And these are affected by a whole range of moderators, which include country, demographics, personality, and a whole range of other things. And then the outcomes, the public health impact in terms of changes in smoking behaviour, and also the economic impact on people. And this is particularly important for low SES groups. I put in an alternate model, which I think I'll skip over in the interest of time. Just making the point from this slide that for any particular policy, the proximal variables vary, as do, in some cases, the distal psychosocial mediators that affect the behaviour. And some of the policy changes may not be affecting quitting behaviour, for example, directly. They may be more focused on just changing people's beliefs or in changing the kinds of products that they use. So the ITC 4-country survey, as I said, is Canada, the USA, England and Australia. It's been fully web-based since 2016 and was mainly phone before that, with a couple of surveys where there was a phone or internet option in between. And the first wave was conducted in 2002. There were 10 waves conducted in England and Australia, and 9 waves conducted in Canada and the US up until 2014, I think. And since then, we've started renumbering our waves from 2016, sorry, and we are now in the process of developing the questionnaire for the 5th wave of data, and the 4th wave of data is imminent to be available for analysis. And more recently, we've been focusing a lot on alternative products. This started out with vaping, which we first started introducing into the surveys about 2010, but have had extensive questions for the last few waves. And more recently, we've included extensive questions, at least in some of the countries, on heated tobacco products, particularly in Japan and Korea, South Korea. And in the last wave or so, we've also included more questions on other alternative nicotine products, like oral nicotine products and snus-like low-toxin smokeless tobacco. So this basically summarises the kind of products that are potentially available. So I'll skip that for now. Moving into the future, our latest funding allows us to coordinate efforts with Aotearoa or New Zealand, and will provide opportunities for evaluating the impact of the incredibly important Endgame policies that New Zealand now have legislated, and we're just waiting to see them implemented. And also the ITC surveys in Japan and South Korea, where the role of heated tobacco products is playing havoc with the smoked tobacco market in a context where, at least in Japan, there's very little tobacco control activity outside of that. So that is a bit of background about the ITC survey. The presentation today is basically on selected data from the 4 country surveys, and it's mainly work I've been directly involved in, and a hell of a lot of other work that I haven't been so directly involved in, that some of which is relevant to the points I'll be making today, but I just didn't have time or space to fit it in, and some of it deals with a whole lot of other issues, just about anything you can think about tobacco control. The ITC survey has something to say about it. Let's start off by some work we've been doing on smokers' beliefs about the contribution to the harm from smoking. And we've asked people what proportion of the harm they believe comes from 4 component causes that are listed on the left of the screen there: nicotine, other substances in unburnt tobacco, substances added to tobacco during manufacture, and combustion products of tobacco. And you can see from the responses, which range from none or very little to all or nearly all, with a don't know group, which is around 1/5 of all respondents have got no idea. You'll see that the ones in green are approximately right or not completely wrong. One can argue about whether other substances in unburnt tobacco gets close to around half. That's probably an exaggeration, but the others are probably fairly accurate. But you'll see that, and we know that most of the harm comes from the combustion products of the tobacco, and little comes from the nicotine, and not a lot comes from the other two sources. But if you look at people's responses, you'll see that there is large levels of misunderstanding. For example, nearly 30% of people believe that more than half or nearly all comes from nicotine, a similar amount from other substances, and even more from substances added during manufacture. So people really don't have much in the way of an idea. Indeed, only 4.1% of our sample of smokers got all 4 approximately correct. And that goes to 2.1 if any who responded don't know to any of them were taken as being wrong. So very few people have a notion that combustion is the main determinant of the harm from smoking. People are also pretty bad at their understanding of the number of smokers who will die prematurely due to their smoking. We asked of 100 smokers, how many will die prematurely due to their smoking? The correct answer, based on the Dole and Pito work, is around 1/2. If you take Emily Banks' Australian more recent study suggesting it might be as much as 2/3, then the 50 to 69 group is the most accurate estimate. As you can see, 40% or so estimate lower, including over 20% who think that the risk is, less than 30%, and some smaller percentage overestimate, but notably 30% of the sample again have no idea. This is for a behaviour that is the most dangerous individual behaviour that most of these people are engaging in. So what is this telling us? I think we need to be asking. In a paper we currently have under review, we asked people what their future nicotine use ambitions were, whether they wanted to continue to smoke, switch to alternative nicotine products, and quit smoking, quit without switching, that's quit everything, and they had no idea what they wanted to do. As you can see, about 1/5 of the sample wanted to continue smoking, and another 8% didn't know. If you take those together, you've got about nearly a third of the sample who are not clearly focused on quitting. And while there's a majority who would like to quit without switching, there is a significant minority who would prefer to switch to alternative products. There's quite a bit of variability around this. looking by country, you can see that the percentage of people wanting to continue to smoke is pretty much the same across the countries, a little bit less in Canada. There's quite a big difference in switching to alternative products, with that being much higher in England, where these products are being promoted more than they are in any of the other 3 countries, and a commensurate less wanting to quit without switching. There are also interesting age differences. Young people are much more open to the idea of switching to alternative products rather than quitting altogether. But again, very little difference in percentage continuing to smoke. The last one I want to mention here is wanting to quit. People who have no desire to quit, most of them want to continue to smoke. People who want to quit a lot, surprisingly, most want to quit without switching. So these responses are quite consistent with other questions we might be asking people. We also know, and we've been contributing to this voluminous literature on the complexity of addiction. This is some work from a paper led by Michael in NTR a couple of years ago, looking at daily smokers at baseline. We found that heaviness of smoking index, which is conventionally used as and conventionally shown to be the best predictor of quitting. We also found additional predictive power for reported urges to smoke and for perceived addiction. But the relationships, even when we included demographics, predictors, and age has some significant variance there, still only accounted for about a quarter of the variance. So our measures of dependence really aren't super good at predicting who's going to successfully quit. We did some further analysis because we found some interesting differences by age, and most of these differences by these measures of dependence showed up in those under 40. Anybody who's smoking daily over the age of 40 seems to be similarly have difficulty quitting, regardless of how many cigarettes they smoke a day or their experienced urges or whatever. We also know, and I haven't got time to cover it in this presentation, and again, our work supports that of others, that non-daily smoking is less stable. Non-daily smokers find it easy to quit, and it's unlikely to be sustained for long enough to create significant health issues in most people, which leads us to suggesting that there should be more of a focus on daily smoking. So what can we take from this? Most smokers are still hopelessly uninformed, and I'd like to suggest that many perhaps don't want to know, or they are actively resisting knowing, or are passively resistant to knowing. We know that for dependent smokers, quitting is hard and likely to need considerable help, and a significant minority are likely to resist strong policies. And raises the question, can alternative products help overcome some of these important barriers? We know also that there are large differences in prevalence of smoking by various forms of disadvantage, and many disadvantaged groups have more trouble staying quit. At least the smokers within the disadvantaged groups have more trouble staying quit. The disadvantaged groups themselves, of course, aren't trying to stay quit. And we also know that most quit attempts fail. Work we did a few years ago suggested that the average smoker by the age of 40 has probably made in the vicinity of 50 failed quit attempts. But there's huge variability around that. Some people will have made very few, and others may have made hundreds of failed attempts. And we also know from our data that most older smokers will never end up succeeding in quitting while they're healthy. Some of them manage to quit after they've had their first heart attack, but if they're lucky enough to survive it. We've also asked people, and some of this this material was presented, or some of this was presented at the Create Symposium last month. So I don't want to spend too much time on it to bore those people who've already seen it. But in our 2018 wave of the ITC survey, we asked, and a 2020 survey, we asked about whether people supported or opposed a proposal to ban the sale of smoked tobacco within 10 years. And in 2018, we gave a cessation focus to it if we provide help for people to quit smoking. And in the 2020 wave, we asked whether they would support it in the context of the government encouraging people to move to alternative products, nicotine products. It may not be immediately apparent from this if people aren't good at reading stacked bar charts, but you should be able to see that support, which is in green, was much less for the alternative nicotine-focused ban than it was for the cessation-focused ban. We don't think that's due to the 2-year difference in asking, although it is possible because in 2020 we had just gone, we were already in the COVID pandemic, and it was only a few months after the Avali episode where vaping incorrectly got nicotine vaping incorrectly got associated with the Avali problem rather than it being contaminants in cannabis vaping. But so it's possible that some of that effect's there. It's also possible that some of the effect is due to us saying the government should encourage the use of these products. And we know that a lot of people don't like the idea of using alternative products to quit. So that may have led to increased opposition. And we didn't have a specific and help people quit smoking or help people quit smoking. So not a lot could be said about the difference. What is interesting is that if we look down at the opposition was generally, strong opposition was generally at least as high or higher than mild opposition, whereas in the case of support, mild support was always stronger than strong support, suggesting that some people that the opposition may in fact be stronger than the support. That where people are opposed, they're much more likely to be strongly opposed. Some things made a difference. Vaping makes a difference. Those people who were current vapers had roughly equivalent support for the two policies, whereas those people who were never or ex-vapers were much less supportive of the nicotine version. There weren't a lot of demographic relationships, and measures of dependence were largely unrelated, but there were strong relationships for motivation to quit. This is the relationship with wanting to quit. The more people wanted to quit, the more they were supportive of both scenarios, but with no evidence of any interaction. And interestingly, people who reported having used NRT either to quit or for any other reason in the previous wave of the survey were less, in the period before the survey, were much more likely to support both scenarios. Interestingly, the effect was at least as strong for the nicotine scenario, suggesting that NRT use may be acting as a general proxy for the acceptability of using alternative products, and in this case seemed to be a stronger predictor even than the specific use of vaping, which one might have expected to be stronger. So what does it all mean? Opposition was greater and stronger, but it was less so in Canada. the cessation scenario was preferred to the nicotine one, except in England, where both scenarios are part of a national approach. And arguably, the English smokers may be seeing the two as similar, while those from other countries see them as quite different alternatives. And the nicotine scenario, as we presented it, may underemphasise cessation help. So in future, we should ask specifically about both if we're going to continue to pursue this line of inquiry. I think there's some sense in the data that some of the responding relates to idealism, not to realism, partly associated with a strong opposition and what predicts support. That indices of dependence were unrelated to support suggests that people aren't taking into account how difficult the task is likely to be for them if smoking is banned, while quit interest and negative attitudes to smoking, which I mentioned before, are quite strongly related, suggests that people are answering, yes, it would be nice, it might help me quit, rather than thinking through, is it actually going to be realistic? Now, I just want to focus in on the third set of bars on the right of this. This is a paper led by Tracy Smith, looking at some other questions we've asked about tobacco control policies among current smokers. The one of relevance here is a nicotine standard. A nicotine standard is essentially the very low nicotine proposal, which is part of the New Zealand proposal. And as you can see, there's around 60%, a bit more in Canada, supportive or strongly supportive of a reduced nicotine standard. Most smokers don't seem to realise that a reduced nicotine standard is effectively prohibition by stealth. It's like taking the alcohol out of beer or wine, and but it seems like a much more benign strategy. So it's clearly it's an approach that, at least in the absence of experience of what it's going to be like, people are much more likely to accept than they are a proposal to totally ban it. And from a strategic point of view, I think New Zealand are probably on a winner there. And I wanted to change tack a little bit and talk a little bit about what level of smoking should we be concerned about. And I think we should be concerned about daily use rather than other use. As I said, non-daily use is less stable and non-daily users are more likely to quit. And then if we do that, then perhaps we should be using non-daily use of smoking as a predictor of future daily use, as a risk factor for daily use rather than as the problem that we're trying to overcome. I think we need to take a similar approach to alternatives. Daily vaping is the only form of vaping associated with successful quitting. Non-daily vaping seems more exploratory, or perhaps even a way of not smoking in some situations. Apology for the typo there. So we should be sticking to a daily versus non-daily. So in 2019, I led a paper arguing that we needed a 9-category scheme where non-daily smoking was treated separately. So we would have, for example, those who are smoking daily but non-daily vaping would be clearly differentiated from what I've called here dual users, those who are using both on a daily basis. And all of the evidence presented in that paper and in other papers since suggests that these two groups are very, very different. If we go for the proposal to focus on daily vaping, then the non-dailies would be included with the non-regular users and be treated as a risk factor for progressing or regressing back to daily use for those who've quit daily use. So a little bit more about vaping and quitting. Our population data is consistent with the randomised controlled trials. Vaping facilitates quitting, but perhaps largely by greater sustained use of nicotine. So the randomized trials and our data and that of others indicates that people who successfully quit using vaping are much more likely to continue to use a nicotine product, typically vaping, than people who quit using no form of help or who quit using NRT or prescription medications, where the uptake or the continued use of NRT, for example, tends to be quite low, and a small percentage of those who quit using NRT end up moving to vaping to prevent relapse. We know from asking people or asking smokers that it's the main reason for people taking up vaping. It's not necessarily that somewhere around 70% or more report that quitting is one of the reasons that they take up vaping, but there are other parallel reasons, like they enjoy it and various other things. But there are relatively few for whom it's not an important reason for quitting. And among ex-smokers who continue to vape, it's a reason for them continuing to vape to prevent relapse. And those who've given up vaping, who are ex-smokers, tell us it's because they no longer need it to stay off smoking. So most smokers are seeing, many smokers at least, are seeing vaping as a strategy for getting off quitting rather than a potential long-term substitution. In one study, and this is one study, relatively small numbers because of the number of people involved, that we found that people who use disposable vapes to quit were less likely, who use disposables were less likely to quit than those who used either rechargeable pod-style devices or open tank systems, which is some evidence that might be used to justify restricting the access to disposables, particularly given disposables seem to be the main form that young people, those under the age of 18, are taking it up. So I think that's potentially important information. We've found some evidence for the preference for tobacco flavour when people quit smoking over others, but they migrate to other flavours after quitting. And in that study, we also, and I thought I put it on this slide, but I must have forgotten. We also found that people who used other flavours other than tobacco, particularly the fruit type flavours, were marginally more likely, but significantly more likely to succeed. So tobacco flavour to quit may not be facilitating quitting, and it potentially could be a risk factor for relapse. So we need to take those sorts of things into account when thinking about potential flavour bans. Here's the data from the Gravely study. Daily vaping and quitting. We found that those people who initiated, this is people who initiated, who weren't vaping at all or not vape regularly at one survey, then surveyed at the next survey to see what had happened, of those who initiated at least monthly vaping and quitting activity. So those who initiated daily vaping were much more likely to have quit than those who initiated only non-daily vaping, who were in some cases significantly less likely to have quit than those who didn't initiate vaping at all. So playing around with a bit of vaping is not a particularly useful cessation strategy. People need to be using the stuff daily, which goes back to my earlier point that we should be focusing on daily use in our analyses. This is some data that we've asked people of what sort of help they used on quit attempts. And we've compared people who reported using help with no help. In this case, help means using some kind of pharmacological help, including vaping. And about 70% of people use some kind of help. And those numbers have been above 50% from around the time that Simon Chapman started telling people that the majority of people quit without help, curiously. There are really no gender-related effects on use of help. Young people are more likely to use help than particularly those over 55 and older, our oldest group. And then we looked at whether people used vaping or approved medications, and approved medications included NRT plus varenicline and other approved medications. And there we found, again, that the young people were much more likely to use vaping for quitting, and they're very unlikely to use it for quitting among the older groups. English smokers were much more likely to be using vaping for over NRT, but in the other countries there was no difference. How am I going for time here? Lost my clock. If we looked at that in relation to some of the smoking-related variables, one of the interesting findings is we found that self-efficacy was not significantly associated with the use of help, which we found to be surprising because we would have expected those who were low in self-efficacy to be much more likely to use help. So that's something I think we need to be exploring in more detail. Urges to smoke, the greater your urges, the more likely you were to use help. The higher your heaviness of smoking index, the more likely you were to use help, and very big effects on previous help. Those people who had not used pharmacological help on their previous quit attempts in the previous wave were much less likely to use help. So people tend to use the sorts of things that they've used before. So those who used approved medication or vape were much more likely to use them again. Interestingly, we asked people about the vaping harm compared with cigarettes, and we also asked about vaping addictiveness with cigarettes, which I haven't got here. But the results are very clear for vaping harm versus cigarettes. Those who said they were equally harmful and don't know were the least likely to use help. And in fact, those who thought vaping was more harmful than cigarettes were somewhat more likely than the equal and don't know group, but not as high as the people who saw vaping as less harmful correctly. When we come to comparing vapes versus approved medication, again, self-efficacy wasn't related, urges weren't related. Heaviness of smoking index was related in that people who used NRT were generally higher in dependence than the ones who chose to vape. This may be a hangover from people believing that NRT is the appropriate thing to use if you're dependent, because there's been a lot of public education around that, and the more recent evidence that that vaping may actually be more effective than NRT and at least as effective as varenicline is probably not permeated down to people at that point. Again, previous help is a really strong predictor. Those who used approved medication last time were much more likely to use them this time, and those who vaped last time were much more likely to vape, even though by definition they had failed using that product or a similar product on their previous attempts. So people tend to use what has failed last time rather than switch. And an ITC paper from several years ago, led by Brian Heckman, we found that people who switched to a different product were more likely to succeed in quitting than those people who tried the same method on their next occasion. So people are not behaving in a completely rational way in terms of their use of help. Again, vaping harm. Those who believe vaping is less harmful are more likely to use vaping, and they had these strange relationships with equal, don't know, and more harmful. So where might vaping contribute to quitting? And this is taken from a paper led by Karen Kasa. There's a whole range of points in where nicotine vaping, in theory, could encourage people to quit, from people who are not planning to quit to plan to quit, for people who don't plan to quit to institute a quit attempt because they take up vaping and that leads them to change their mind, and various other pathways in between. What Karen and the rest of us found in that paper was that those not planning to quit at one wave who take up daily vaping were much more likely to quit than those people who were not planning to quit but didn't take up vaping or took up non-daily vaping. So taking up daily vaping among those not interested in quitting was actually leading to some of them quitting. So that pathway of getting the uninterested interested because they presumably see some potential for quitting because vaping is replacing some of the things that they believe that they couldn't do without with smoking. But there was no evidence of this pattern for those planning to quit in the next month at baseline. So people were equally likely to quit whether they took up vaping or not. So this is part of, I think, an increasing body of evidence. Vaping is attracting smokers who would not otherwise try to quit. So it's playing a role in getting some additional people who don't see any of the alternative ways of quitting as viable for them to consider quitting. So that's an important role. I think I'll skip that in the interest of time. What about vaping longer term? If people are going to successfully quit using vaping and use it at least in the medium term, what are the likely consequences for them? Is this a bad thing to happen, or is it potentially beneficial? The long-term effects of vaping long-term are unknown, both for those people with a history of smoking and even more so for those who've never been a regular smoker. But the ITC project is making some contribution to understanding medium-term effects compared with complete cessation. We've now published 2 papers on that. One of them, led by Michael, showed better stress management, at least perceived stress management, among those who continue to vape as compared with those who quit all nicotine. And another paper led by Lynn Lee found similarly using different measures of stress management. So stress management would seem to be potentially less compromised or improved as a result of continuing to vape as compared with quitting everything. The paper led by Michael also found a small but significant improved perception of day-to-day health among the vapers compared with those who quit altogether. I think that result really does need to be replicated because it's not altogether clear why continuing to vape would improve your day-to-day health over quitting everything. It may be because they feel better able to cope with stress and it's a sort of related to the stress management function, or it's just a chance effect that certainly needs replication. But importantly, we found no clear evidence of negative effects. So there's nothing to suggest that people who continue to vape, at least in the medium term, the next couple of years, are having any negative effects on their perceived health. So in conclusion, getting smokers to quit, especially daily smokers, is very difficult. Some are actively or even passively resisting this. Alternative nicotine products, especially vaping, are being increasingly used, often by those who would not otherwise try. We know they're demonstrably effective, but they may require long-term use, and medium-term use doesn't appear problematic. And these findings, I think, are broadly consistent with much of the other literature, suggesting overall that vaping is likely to be contributing to the decline in smoking and to the increased decline in smoking that we're finding in countries which have allowed vaping at higher levels than in countries like Australia, which have tended to suppress them. With that, I will end, and this is funded by a whole lot of grants. The most recent ones are included here. I haven't got the CRE one on that. My apologies. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ron. So we've got a few questions here for you from the audience.
Good.
Okay, so among people who smoke and vape and who do not want to stop, why do they want to keep smoking or vaping? So I think you've kind of answered the vaping one, that, you know, people were reporting that they enjoyed it, the vaping. But what about smoking? Is it similar or is it different?
Well, the difference with smoking in terms of the almost certain reality is that all the benefits of smoking come with the not inconsiderable, indeed huge downsides, that it has a very strong chance of killing you prematurely. And we know that the average smoker loses somewhere in the vicinity of 10 years of useful quality adjusted life compared with a non-smoker. So it's a huge trade-off for whatever benefits people are getting from smoking. Now, it's conventional to suggest that the only reason people smoke is that they're addicted to it. But this is an oversimplistic view, and it leads people to a whole lot of wrong conclusions, in my view. Nicotine itself is quite an attractive drug. Nicotine is associated with some improvement in some cognitive functions. The data on that is not totally conclusive, but it's very strongly suggestive that it is. People enjoy the experience of smoking. It's and part of the reason that they become dependent is because it's enjoyable. Indeed, all addictive activities are enjoyable in the moment in which you're engaging in them. They just have lots of negative consequences. And so people are drawn to nicotine use because it's fun, and it may have cognitive benefits. One of the interesting things we've found, just to finish that, is that people who believe that smoking helps their concentration, or people who believe that it helps them cope with stress, is not much related to whether they successfully quit or not. So the things that stop people quitting are the more dependence related rather than the instrumental effects. Sorry, Coral, next question.
Okay, so what were the characteristics that set the people apart who didn't want to quit? So you were saying that it was an addiction. So are you saying that the people who are smoking are saying they don't want to quit smoking have lower addiction levels, or do they have higher or the same?
Well, the people who don't want to quit smoking, there aren't big differences in those kinds of factors. All of the work and some of the stuff I presented there suggests that basically, at least by the time you've got to around 40, if you're smoking daily, you're addicted. And the evidence for before 40 is also that basically most of the difference that you get from the effect of heaviness of smoking, for example, is between the very lightly dependent, so the people who smoke only a couple of cigarettes a day, and the people who smoke much more than that. So pretty much all daily smokers are dependent, and while there's a bit of variation as a function of the number of cigarettes you smoke and a bit of variation associated with how soon in the day you smoke, these aren't particularly strong predictors. In the latter case, perhaps because of environmental constraints on when you can have your first cigarette. if you're living in an apartment and have to actually go outside to smoke into a public area on a veranda, you can't do that. You're reluctant to do that until you're appropriately clothed. And in Melbourne in winter, I can assure you that you actually need to put on some extra clothes if you're going to do something like that. The small amount of heat from the cigarette's not enough to keep you warm. So people don't like, delay going outside for their first cigarette. People who still smoke in their homes can light up one while they're lying in bed. So that kind of variability, I think, is reducing the utility of some of these measures. But even so, I think there's more to dependence than just the amount you smoke, because people vary in the extent to which they metabolize the nicotine. People who metabolize the nicotine quickly need to smoke more to maintain the nicotine levels. People who metabolize it more slowly need to smoke less, and that may not have a strong impact on their ability to successfully quit.
Right. Okay. So moving on to people who had used the approved medications, so, NRTs, varenicline, bupropion, and so on. Do we have any data in the ITC about whether they use those optimally, like they used enough NRT, or did they just continue using the Champix early and so on?
We have asked how often they use, yes, and most people report using them on a daily basis. It's more difficult to get data on how many. I don't think we've asked the number of pieces of nicotine gum people use, for example, or the number of times they puff on an inhalator, or. But we have asked about daily use, and but the majority of those who use them daily. The other issue and complication of this is that, do people only use, we've also asked people the length of time they use, but linking that to when they relapse is complicated, and I don't think we've done that as well as we could. It would be nice to know whether people were using it daily before they quit, or they stopped using it daily because they relapsed back to smoking. So those kinds of sequential relationships we haven't plotted out as well as we might, and in the limited number of questions you can ask in a survey that's already 40 odd minutes long, asking a detailed set of questions like that tends to get on the cutting room floor when we're deciding which questions come and which go, unfortunately.
Yeah. So it probably needs some very specific questions about whether people tried to keep using the product after they had a slip up, or whether they just took that as being the things failed.
Yeah. So some really detailed questions about the patterns of use and how often they were using it in the lead up, whether they continue to try and use it as often to try and help them recover from slip ups and things. Although we know that at least in the pre-vaping era, slip-ups had a very high percentage of complete relapse. So you didn't need to slip up very often to relapse. In the vaping era, where people, there is some more evidence, at least anecdotal evidence, that people who are vaping to quit will just continue vaping and will tolerate the occasional slip up. And in fact, some will tolerate having the occasional deliberate cigarette because they feel confident that they can go back to their vaping and they won't relapse. But there's not good hard quantitative data on that.
Okay, so in terms of you mentioned about focusing on people who smoke daily rather than people who are smoking non-daily. So there's a question here about given that people who smoke non-daily are more likely to succeed in quitting when they decide to quit, would there be some populations where that may be worthwhile focusing on, because those people can then act as role models of people who stop smoking? So it may be, there may be some argument for also focusing on people who are smoking non-daily to help them completely stop.
I'm not suggesting that we don't focus on people who are non-daily smokers at all. We certainly want to discourage them from transitioning to daily use. Typically, they have less problem quitting because they haven't developed some of the dependence-related factors that make quitting hard for daily independent users. So they're not a particularly good role model because they're doing it easy. They're the people, if something's easy, you're often not a good role model for people who actually find something difficult. So I don't think they're useful role models. They're a group of people who are clearly at risk of, particularly young people, of becoming daily smokers, and we should definitely be looking at strategies to prevent the transition to regular use. But often in tobacco control, we sort of take anybody who's smoked at all and treat them as a smoker, and I think that actually leads to conceptual confusion that we really need to be focusing in on. Has this person developed a serious smoking habit? And that's the thing that's going to kill them. Anybody who smokes for, a bit for a while, there's no good evidence that unless they've got cystic fibrosis or bad asthma, that it really has any significant adverse effects on their long-term health. The work of Doll and Pito, for example, found that people who quit smoking by the age of 30, they're unable to detect any long-term negative effects on their longevity. So you've got to smoke for a while on a regular basis to do enough damage to your system that it's not able to repair itself.
Okay, so you've got on one of your slides, you mentioned you have vaping long-term, but how is medium-term vaping defined?
Well, we've basically defined it in people, the people who continue to be in our survey. So we recruit, but in the past, we've only recruited active smokers. Over the last couple of waves, we've been recruiting active vapers as well. But typically, most of our data is on people who've quit smoking within the last couple of years, up to about 4 years or so. So that, in effect, defines the medium term. So so most of those will have quit for less than 2 years, for example. We have one study, which I can't quite remember the results of, where we've found somewhat different patterns of people who've quit for a shorter period to a longer period in terms of, well, certainly in terms of the relapse prevention, but I don't think anything related to their perceived health effects, although that's complicated because in some of our questions on perceived health, we've asked people about changes since they quit or changes in the last 6 months. If people have been quit for more than a year, we wouldn't expect changes in the last 6 months because that'd be changes from 6 months quit to a year quit, or from a year quit to a year and a half quit. Whereas the people who quit relatively recently may be expecting some change over the shorter period. So it is complicated.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're just about right up to the hour now. So I'm sorry for those people I didn't get to your questions to put to Ron, but thank you everyone who's joined us today. And thank you, Ron, for presenting today.
Righto, people have got urgent questions. My email email addresses on the bottom of that slide. Do feel free to send me an email and I'll try and answer them. But so that's an open invitation. And anybody who's interested who's not involved in the ITC project, who'd like to be interested in looking at the possibilities, there are huge possibilities of data that hasn't been adequately analysed. So the more hands we have on that, the better.
Okay. Thanks again. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.